Hi, this is Nick with the Box Institute, and this week we're going to be doing a lecture on resolutional analysis. Now, while this topic can get very complicated, this video is meant as sort of an overview, but I'm trying to put in things that'll help some of the more advanced debaters give you things to think about. Now, the first question is always, so what? Why do we care about resolutional analysis? And there's a couple reasons, and they're pretty important. The first one is that analyzing the resolution helps define the boundaries of what you say the resolution is. So you can say we're talking about this thing, but not this other thing that's closely related. And clearly this has some pretty strategic implications. If you can say that your opponent's case falls outside the realm of what you're talking about, then you can gain a huge advantage. And another smaller benefit that it has is it can sort of tell the judge, here's what this case is going to be about. A second thing that resolutional analysis does is it sets out the groundwork for what you have to prove to win the round. Now, generally, you have to prove the resolution true, and there are some exceptions to this. We'll get to those in another lecture. But generally, you have to prove the resolution true. So, if that's your job, what you should do is you should try to tell the judge, here's what the resolution is, here's what it really means, and do that in a way that's fair, that isn't clearly biased towards you, but puts a thumb on the scale in your favor. So, all a resolution is a bunch of words. And in order to define meaning from that, we have to answer, well, what do words mean? We can answer that question from a couple places. We can look at dictionaries, which are big books of what words mean. We could look up, for example, the words commander and in and chief, but that wouldn't really give us the true meaning of what they're talking about here, so we can also look to topic literature. The advantage of looking to topic literature is we can get a more in-depth, a more nuanced, a more technically precise meaning of what words mean, and that can be very useful in a debate setting. At a really abstract level, what we're trying to do here is answer a question of how broadly or how narrowly do we define terms. And in a sense, topicality is sort of an extension of that. It just says that either your definition is too narrow, it's overbroad, or it's, well, the right amount of narrow, but it's focused at the wrong part of the resolution. And some of you may have noticed that if we're looking for words in technical literature or in dictionaries, that can come with a lot of unstated cultural assumptions. And there are cases out there, and there are valid approaches that say that we have to deconstruct those, and we have to basically, at an abstract level, go for a super broad understanding of what particular words mean. So words like power or civil. So if we're looking broader, that means that it can make your opponent's case become only conditionally affirmative or negative, and that can get you a lot of ground. The downside to an approach like this is that you really have to show that there is something fundamentally flawed with their definition as it stands. Basically, that taking a broader approach actually gets you something that their case doesn't handle, not that there isn't just some epistemic doubt about the broadness and the appropriateness of their definition. So in this super abstract way of viewing debate, a resolution is just words that are in a particular order that we derive a particular meaning from, which means that resolutional analysis is us proving that the interpretation we're drawing is a valid one. Little things matter. So are the words we're using technical? Do they have a technical description in literature? Or are they just general words? How are they arranged? I've got a little cartoon over here that talks about the Oxford comma. So even the simple inclusion of a comma can change the meaning of what something can mean, because you could interpret the bottom text as meaning the top text if it's clear from the circumstances, or you could interpret it the way of the bottom text. Both of those are valid in the bottom example. The top example, the only valid interpretation is the one that's given. So the way these little things matter because they can expand or contract the bounds of what is reasonably allowable in the debate. Now, this can seem technical and pedantic, but it's actually really important. So an example is there's a Supreme Court case that hinged on how you interpret the word carry. Suppose there's a law that says it's a felony to carry a weapon during a drug deal. Now, does this mean that carrying a gun in my hands, that counts? Or, can I carry it on my person? Or, in the case of Muscarello, the case that this is derived from, am I carrying a gun if I have the gun in a locked glove box and I never touch the glove box, but I'm doing the drug deal in that car? Is that carrying? How broadly do we interpret the word carry? And in this case, how broadly we interpret that term determines whether or not somebody goes to prison for an additional number of years. So in the real world, these little distinctions matter. They can matter in debate too. In Muscarello, the court had the advantage of a whole law to look at. All we have in debate is the resolution. But in either case, Supreme Court Justice Felix Frankfurter said, when you're doing sort of a textual analysis, a statutory interpretation in this case, he has a three-part framework that says you start with the text, the text, the text. So we want to look at the resolution. And when we look at a resolution, we're looking for particular things. The first answer is, well, what are the actual words of the resolution? Make sure you've got the wording exactly correct. Also with that is what words aren't in the resolution. For example, the novice civil disobedience topic just says in a democracy. It doesn't say in a liberal or rights-respecting democracy. And this distinction is important because it doesn't say that, well, we're going to assume that rights are going to be respected. We're just looking to majority rule. And that can change the way you interpret a topic. So it's important to not make assumptions about what words are there. Look only to the words that are there. In statutory interpretation, there's a canon called expressio unis es exclusio alteris, which translates to saying one thing means excluding other things. So if there is a general list that doesn't include an etc., that means that you're only looking to those things. This can also be applied to concepts like when in conflict. That means that you're only looking to when X and Y conflict and not to other times, because if the people who framed the resolution want you to consider at times besides when these two things were in conflict, they could have included a or at any other time. And because they didn't, we're only looking to when X and Y conflict. If you're going to be analyzing a resolution, a very good place to start is to look at who the actor or agent in the resolution is, if there is one. Is it an individual? Is it the United States? Is it a just government? Because those all have different interpretations, those all mean different things. So, for example, you could say, well, if there's just a just government, it's not inconsistent with that language for me to argue, well, Finland is a just government and Finland ought to do blank. But if the actor in the resolution is the United States, you can't talk about what Finland should or shouldn't. So when we're defining who the actor is, we're also defining who the actor could be if there's some ambiguity there. And this will get you a lot because it's important to focus on why that agent is special, or why that agent is uniquely suited to solving the problems that are kind of indicted in the resolution. It's important to look at this sort of specificity because when you get into topics like this, it sort of also helps define what you have to prove because an individual can only do certain things. In adolescence, you can do some things but not others, and you're legally allowed to do some other things. Or if you're talking about the United States, it occupies a certain position in the world. But sometimes you get into situations where the actor isn't really clear. And when that happens, you can ignore this and you have to focus on other things like what is the action to be done. The resolution of whether the right to be forgotten ought to be a civil right is a great example of a resolution that doesn't have an actor, but it has a question of whether something ought to exist. In a sense, these resolutions are a little purer because they just ask whether or not an idea is good or just or moral. When a resolution has a thing to be done and an actor, it can get a little more complicated because there are a couple ways to put that together. This can become more complicated because when you're doing resolutional analysis, what you're asking is my interpretation consistent with the resolution? Certain resolutions have different things that are consistent with them. The US has an obligation to do blank, and the US ought to do blank are asking the same question. In another sense, they're asking slightly different questions. One is about the existence of a duty, and the other is about an obligation to act in a particular way, which could be based on a duty or it could be based on some other consideration. So when you're thinking about this, preferring one interpretation over the other can open the doors to slightly different arguments, and those can be easier to prove depending on the evidence that you have. So it's important to look at what exactly is being asked and whether what you want to argue is consistent with that interpretation. As though this wasn't complicated enough, sometimes the resolution will bring in additional factors for us to consider that can affect the way we interpret the resolution. These qualifiers can do two things. First, they can introduce situations where a moral obligation may particularly exist or may be particularly difficult to introduce. The other thing it can do is it can introduce a bit more ambiguity or open the debate space up a little more for more possibilities. For example, when we say, in the United States, truth-seeking ought to be acknowledged over privileged communication, does that mean that the United States is the actor, or only that the act has to happen in the United States? The different elements of the resolution are building blocks, and the way you assemble them and the way you choose to interpret them will fundamentally decide how your case shakes out in the end. This is where putting the pieces together comes into play. So if you know when a particular agent has a moral obligation, when that particular agent has a moral obligation to do a thing, and when a particular agent has a moral obligation to do a thing when other factors are present, you can start seeing a case start to take shape. And when you start to see these building blocks come into place, then the case naturally follows from that. The way you interpret certain terms, how broadly or narrowly you interpret them, impacts the way the rest of your case flows. If you're really smart about how you interpret the resolution, you can make it easier or more difficult to write the rest of your case. And obviously, you want to make it easier, so be very conscious about the decisions you're making when you're interpreting the resolution. Like I said at the beginning, this is only meant to be a general overview of strategy. There are a lot of different ways you can approach it and a lot of specific questions that can come up depending on your particular style and how you want to debate. So there are a lot of ways to get a hold of us. We can help you through that process answering specific questions and help you become a better debater. There will be an assignment for this particular lesson coming out on Wednesday. Be sure to turn in last week's lesson if you haven't done that on the same day. And if you haven't done week 1, no pressure, just get it into us, that's all we ask. And from the Boxer Institute, this is Nick, signing off.